The moment still burns in my chest. 12 years of loyalty erased with one sentence. Ethan Cole, our shiny new VP of Operations, stood in front of the entire floor and told me I was legacy baggage. Just like that, I was out. No warning, no dignity, just a public execution of my career. What he didn't realize was that firing me wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his collapse. Quick pause. Where are you tuning in from? Comment your city, hit that like button, and subscribe. You'll want to stick around because Ethan's downfall was only just beginning. For 12 years, I had poured myself into that company, building systems that passed federal audits, patching holes no one else even noticed, and mentoring staff who grew into leaders because someone believed in them. That work became part of who I was, which is why the announcement of a new vice president of operations struck me differently than most. His name was Ethan Cole, and from the moment he arrived, he carried himself like he owned the air in the room. He wasn't interested in understanding what we had built, or asking how we survived under impossible deadlines. He wanted a stage. In his first meeting, he repeated his motto, "Legacy slows velocity," as though repeating it could erase the years of institutional knowledge that kept our contracts alive. People clapped, mostly the newer hires who didn't yet know how fragile stability could be. I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but because I already understood what was happening. Ethan wasn't here to strengthen us. He was here to replace resilience with performance theater. Within days, long-standing review sessions disappeared from the calendar, replaced with vision talks that accomplished nothing. When I asked him how compliance obligations would be met without documentation, he smirked and brushed me aside like I was an interruption instead of a safeguard. That moment told me everything I needed to know. Ethan didn't see me as a partner or even a professional. He saw me as weight to cut loose. By the end of his first month, the culture we had built through years of struggle and trust was already being stripped down. Ethan didn't understand it yet, but the very foundation he was dismissing was the only thing keeping his big promises from collapsing. It didn't take long for Ethan Cole's style of leadership to reveal itself as something more dangerous than arrogance. Within weeks of his arrival, he began dismantling the structures that had kept us steady for over a decade, cutting away at processes he barely understood and replacing them with buzzwords that sounded impressive in PowerPoint decks but collapsed in practice. He eliminated the compliance playbooks we used to survive federal audits, insisting that agility trumps bureaucracy, a line that made interns nod but left seasoned staff exchanging nervous glances. When I raised the risk of losing certification on one of our largest contracts, he laughed lightly and told the room, "We'll innovate faster than regulators can catch us." It wasn't bravado. It was recklessness packaged as vision. The damage grew subtle at first. Meetings that once centered on risk management were replaced by daily stand-ups where numbers mattered more than substance. Ethan would call on Chloe to present design metrics and interrupt halfway through, praising Ryan, his new protege, for repeating ideas we had been executing for years. Marcus stopped offering technical warnings because every objection was brushed aside with Ethan's favorite phrase, "Fail forward." He wielded those words like a shield, deflecting accountability and turning serious issues into supposed opportunities. The irony was painful. Those of us who had spent nights keeping systems alive weren't failing forward, we were being forced backward. Ethan wasn't only undermining workflows, he was isolating people. One by one, I found myself excluded from meetings I had built from scratch. My name disappeared from planning documents, and when I asked about being left off distribution lists, I was told new alignment models were being tested. HR, led by Samantha Green, offered no explanation beyond tight smiles and rehearsed reassurances that leadership had a bold vision. I knew what that meant. Keep quiet, endure the storm. But silence doesn't fix broken systems. The day I realized how much ground we had lost came during a client readiness review. For years, I had owned that process, walking external partners through every detail of our infrastructure, anticipating questions, and providing the receipts that proved we could handle their data responsibly. This time, Ethan led the meeting, armed with slides full of jargon and inspirational slogans. When the client pressed for specifics on regulatory compliance, he stumbled, then gestured toward Ryan as if the young PM could improvise decades of expertise. The client left unconvinced, and my inbox filled with escalation emails that night. Ethan never acknowledged the near miss. Instead, he congratulated the team in Slack for their adaptability and reminded everyone that disruption always feels like chaos before clarity. It wasn't clarity I felt. It was betrayal. Behind the polished rhetoric, Ethan was hollowing us out, stripping the company of the very resilience that had made us valuable. Staff whispered in hallways, Slack messages grew more guarded, and the Friday newsletters HR once sent out stopped appearing altogether. The silence was deliberate. The trust that once kept us pulling late nights together had been replaced by fear and confusion. Ethan thought he was proving strength by erasing history. What he was really doing was laying the foundation for collapse, and I could feel it inching closer every day. The breaking point came faster than I expected. We were in the middle of a Monday all-hands, the kind of forced gathering Ethan Cole loved to stage because it gave him a live audience. The floor was packed, screens glowing with slides plastered in slogans about velocity and reinvention, none of it grounded in the real systems that actually kept our clients from walking out the door. Ethan paced at the front like a talk show host, calling on juniors to answer questions they had no business carrying, while veterans like me sat in silence, sidelined in plain sight. I had learned to keep my objections measured, to document issues quietly and fix what I could behind the scenes. But that morning, he put me directly in the line of fire. He pulled up a new delivery timeline for one of our biggest federal contracts, a schedule so reckless I knew it couldn't survive first contact with reality. Scripts hadn't been validated, vendor integrations were still buggy, and our compliance audit was weeks away from completion. I raised my hand, steady but firm, and said we needed to adjust deadlines before exposing ourselves to unnecessary risk. Ethan didn't hesitate. He smiled that rehearsed grin and said loud enough for the entire floor to hear, "Margaret, you're exactly why we struggle to move forward. You are legacy baggage." The words landed like a slap. Conversations froze, keyboards stilled, and the room went silent. My chest tightened, but I kept my face composed. He wasn't done. He turned to Ryan, the junior he had been grooming, and declared him the new lead for the project. Then he looked back at me, voice sharp and final, and said, "If you can't adapt, you're done here." There it was, a public execution of 12 years of loyalty condensed into a single sentence. No private meeting, no documentation, just humiliation as theater. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. I closed my notebook, slid my badge onto the desk, and stood. The sound of my chair scraping back felt louder than his entire speech. I walked out without looking at anyone, but I could feel the shock radiating from the rows behind me. Ethan believed he had proved dominance. What he didn't realize was that by firing me so publicly, he had just ripped out the keystone holding his fragile structure together. And while he basked in the silence of his authority, I knew the collapse had already begun. The first week after I was fired, I expected to feel grief or anger, but what I felt instead was an eerie kind of clarity. For 12 years, I had been the one plugging gaps, updating compliance logs, and keeping clients calm when technical issues threatened to spiral. Without me there, the cracks Ethan Cole had ignored were no longer hidden by my late nights and quiet fixes. They split wide open for everyone to see. The first rupture came from a compliance deliverable tied to one of our federal contracts. I had always tracked those deadlines like sacred scripture, knowing one missed submission could trigger penalties worth millions. With me gone, no one noticed the calendar alert buried in the system. The report wasn't filed, and when the agency reached out for answers, Ethan brushed it off as administrative clutter. By the time he realized the seriousness, it was too late. Penalty clauses had already been invoked. Internally, chaos spread. Marcus struggled to keep the development pipeline from crashing when untested code was deployed live. He had warned Ethan about regression testing, but without me documenting the impact, Ethan dismissed it as perfectionism. The system buckled, dashboards glitched, and 2 clients escalated directly to the board. Chloe, who once thrived in design reviews, found herself being blamed for integration delays that had nothing to do with her. Ryan, the junior PM Ethan had thrust into leadership, looked pale and exhausted, drowning in responsibilities he wasn't equipped to handle. His Slack messages, once filled with emojis and enthusiasm, turned into late-night pings begging colleagues for help he couldn't publicly admit he needed. I stayed silent, at least on the surface. Outwardly, I was gone, but I kept tabs through messages from former teammates who trusted me more than the man still strutting around with slogans. Daniel Price, the senior analyst who had always respected my work, called one evening to tell me the attrition rate was rising. "It's unraveling, Margaret," he said, voice heavy. "They're pretending it's fine, but you can feel it in the air." And then came the message that cut through my composure. Emily Torres, the intern I had mentored, sent me an email that simply read, "You taught me that pushing back isn't rebellion, it's respect." I resigned today. I couldn't stay in a place that calls experience baggage. I reread her words until my screen blurred. Ethan had thought firing me was a show of power, but all it did was prove that loyalty meant nothing under his rule. One by one, people were realizing the same truth, and as I watched from the outside, it became clear that the collapse wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Once Emily's message landed in my inbox, it was like the first stone tipping over in a line I hadn't even realized had been set up. The next day, Daniel Price called again, this time not just to vent, but to inform me that Chloe had resigned. She had walked out without fanfare, leaving her projects half-finished rather than continue absorbing blame for Ethan Cole's reckless deadlines. Within 48 hours, Marcus followed. He didn't bother with a goodbye Slack post. He simply shut down his workstation and left a resignation email with 2 sentences. "I won't build systems designed to fail." Good luck Ryan lasted a little longer, but even he cracked under the weight of being Ethan's chosen protege. He was supposed to prove Ethan right, to replace me as proof that loyalty and expertise were expendable. Instead, he broke down in front of his peers, admitting privately that he couldn't keep up. Days later, he submitted his notice, leaving Ethan without the figurehead he had propped up to justify firing me. Word spread quickly. People in departments outside operations started reaching out, not to ask for advice, but to confess their own exhaustion. A designer from another floor wrote, "We used to stay because we trusted each other. Now we stay out of fear, and I'm done." Even product managers I barely knew were leaving mid-cycle, some without other jobs lined up. They weren't following me. They were fleeing him. Each departure added weight to the silence Ethan tried to ignore. HR inboxes filled with resignation letters, Samantha Green scrambled to schedule retention calls, but the tone had shifted. People weren't negotiating for raises or promotions. They were done pretending this was leadership. From the outside, I didn't gloat. I sat in my apartment reading the flood of messages, feeling the strange mix of sadness and vindication settle over me. I hadn't staged a walkout, hadn't whispered in anyone's ear. I had simply been fired. And by firing me, Ethan had pulled the pin on a grenade he couldn't control. The company wasn't losing talent gradually. It was bleeding out in real time. The dominoes had started to fall, and there was no one left inside strong enough to stop the chain reaction. When the resignations piled too high to ignore, the company's polished facade finally began to fracture. Samantha Green, the HR manager who had once smiled through Ethan Cole's reckless experiments, could no longer disguise the churn. She called me 2 weeks after my firing, her voice quieter than I remembered, almost as if she were speaking from the far side of a closed door. "Margaret," she said, "I'm not calling to ask you to come back. I just want you to know, it's not just operations anymore. The board is asking questions." For the first time, I felt the shift. HR wasn't in control. Ethan wasn't in control. The board was. The people with the power to count not just culture but cost had begun to notice the hemorrhaging. It started with the audit. Compliance gaps that I had once documented in color-coded reports were suddenly glaring holes in Ethan's operation. Penalty notices from federal contracts stacked up. Vendors flagged missed commitments. Legal flagged exposure points. Samantha told me the board had ordered a full review of Ethan's decisions, not just in operations but across any project he touched. That kind of scrutiny wasn't cosmetic. It was surgical. Inside the building, Daniel Price relayed scenes that bordered on surreal. Ethan still tried to run stand-ups with his game show smile, but his audience had thinned. Empty desks lined the rows where Chloe and Marcus once sat. Ryan's departure left no buffer between Ethan's slogans and the reality of deadlines no one believed in anymore. Samantha scheduled him into Conference Room B with the board's audit committee, and for the first time, Ethan walked into a room where charm couldn't save him. On the long wooden table lay printed resignation letters, dozens of them. Samantha slid them across to him and said simply, "This is the cost of your leadership." Ethan tried to spin, claiming resistance to change was natural, that legacy staff were uncomfortable with accountability. But the board wasn't looking for theater. They asked about missed audits, penalty clauses, and lost contracts. They asked why 12 resignations had landed in a single month. They asked why retention reports had been buried instead of escalated. For every answer Ethan gave, there was a document to contradict him. For every excuse, a timeline that revealed negligence. When Daniel described it to me later, he said Ethan's confidence drained in real time. The smirk he wore like armor gave way to clipped phrases, then silence. For a man who thrived on the sound of his own voice, that silence was damning. By the end of the meeting, the board informed him that a leadership transition was imminent. He wasn't fired on the spot, but he might as well have been. His access was curtailed, his projects frozen, and his authority cut to ribbons. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. Ethan had walked in believing he could charm his way past attrition and audit trails. He walked out facing a future where every one of his shortcuts was now evidence. Accountability had arrived, not with a headline or applause, but with quiet signatures and empty chairs. The empire he thought he had built on vision had been measured against reality and found hollow. When the news reached me that Ethan Cole was being removed, I didn't feel like celebrating. What I felt was the heavy truth settling in. He had ended my career there with one cruel sentence, but in doing so, he exposed himself. By firing me in front of everyone, he revealed how little he valued the loyalty and experience that actually kept the company from sinking. The collapse that followed wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow unraveling of trust until even the board could no longer deny the damage. My exit wasn't victory, but it was clarity. Ethan had built his power on fear and slogans, but fear doesn't hold people, and slogans don't protect contracts. What holds a team together is respect, process, and the belief that their work matters. That's what he destroyed, and that's why he fell. For me, the ending wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my worth, remembering that walking away from a broken system can be the strongest move you make. I took a position at a competitor, one that values expertise instead of discarding it. The moral is simple. Firing the wrong person can unravel an entire system because loyalty and experience aren't baggage, they're the foundation of survival. Looking back on what happened, I realized the real lesson isn't about the dramatic moment when Ethan Cole fired me in front of everyone, but about what came after. His mistake wasn't just arrogance, it was believing that loyalty and expertise were disposable. When you take away the people who quietly hold systems together, the cracks eventually show. My firing exposed how fragile his leadership really was, and the collapse that followed wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense, but the natural consequence of neglecting respect, trust, and accountability. The deeper truth is that silence isn't loyalty, and fear isn't leadership. Too often in American workplaces, people are pressured to stay quiet, to accept dysfunction as normal, to let someone else take the credit while experience is dismissed as legacy baggage. But the reality is this: the knowledge you've built, the care you've put in, the long nights you've carried a team on your back, those things matter more than flashy slogans. Leaders who forget that eventually pay the price, not because someone burns them down, but because they burn themselves out by dismantling the very foundation that kept them afloat. My takeaway for you is simple. Don't undervalue yourself, and don't mistake survival in a toxic system for loyalty. If you've been carrying more than your share, if your work is consistently invisible, remember that stepping away can be the most powerful statement you make. Sometimes walking out isn't weakness, it's the trigger that forces truth into the light. And when you protect your integrity, you inspire others to do the same. How to get started today. Write down the unique value you bring to your workplace. Be clear about your worth. Document your contributions so you never question whether they mattered. Reach out to someone you mentor or trust, and remind them that speaking up is respect, not rebellion. Before you go, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to share this story with someone who needs it, and hit that subscribe button, because more stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss them.